Hello everyone, my name is Emma and today I'm going to be presenting the findings from my independent research project on the relationship between narcissism and emotional regulation. The research question I am presenting is, to what extent does narcissism have an impact on someone's emotional regulation capabilities? I'm hypothesizing that there will be a positive, strong correlation between narcissism and emotional regulation, more specifically, cognitive reappraisal. Before we go further, I want to define a few key terms that will be important to know for this presentation. First, cognitive reappraisal is defined as the reinterpretation of an emotional eliciting situation so as to modify the emotional impact. An example of this would be if you were driving to a party and you accidentally took a wrong turn. Your first thought might be, why is this road so confusing? Why can't this city just get it together? If you were to reappraise the situation, you might then think, well, at least that's 30 minutes less of having to listen to Emily talk. This reappraisal of the situation can help you loosen your grip on the anger you had when you considered the first reappraisal. The second definition I want to define is grandiose narcissism. This is characterized by feelings of superiority, feeling as though you are special, and feeling as though you are too good for anything ordinary. On the other hand, vulnerable narcissism is essentially the opposite. It can be characterized by feelings of shame, insecurity, and high levels of neuroticism. There are a few rich journal articles I would like to touch on, the first one being by Zhang and colleagues. These researchers found that there is an indirect effect on narcissism on emotional regulation, with self-esteem being a mediating variable. The second journal article is from Ziegler and Vonk and found that those who exhibited higher levels of grandiose narcissism were better able to regulate their emotions than those high in vulnerable narcissism. If we draw from what Zhang and colleagues concluded from their research study, this association is likely because those high in grandiose narcissism have higher self-esteems than those high in vulnerable narcissism. Fries and colleagues found something similar, but on the other end of the spectrum, and that is when there is a mismatch between self-perception and external feedback. Individuals high in vulnerable narcissism tend to experience negative emotions. And this is interesting because in this particular study, the Confederates rated essays submitted by participants and found that negative emotions were elicited when the Confederates rated the essays as poor, but when the participants rated their essays as good, which would make sense. You know, if you think you did something good and someone said, no, it's actually bad, you would feel kind of bad about it. But when the Confederates rated the essays as good, but the participants rated the essays as poor, there was still a negative emotion elicited, which is the interesting part because you would think that you would feel good about it, but they actually didn't. They still felt negative emotions. So in my research study, I recruited 70 undergraduates from a research methods class in VCU. 50 of these participants were cisgendered females and 12 were cisgendered males. I did not obtain consent prior to collecting the data, and the measures I used include the Emotional Regulation Questionnaire to measure cognitive reappraisal and the 4 Identities Questionnaire to measure narcissism. Participants were instructed to take the aforementioned surveys in exchange for class credit. I conducted a Pearson correlation analysis and found that the average score for the 4 Identities Questionnaire was 3.07 with a standard deviation of 0.74. The average score for the Emotional Regulation Questionnaire is 30.44 with a standard deviation of 6.69. These results showed a statistically significant moderate positive association with an R value of 0.31 and a P value of 0.01. There was also an R squared value of 0.10. These findings supported my hypothesis. Those who are high in narcissism have better emotional regulation capabilities than those who are not high in narcissism. These findings reinforce the ideas from previous research studies and can provide a basis for future research. However, there are some limitations in my study. First, my sample is not representative. I only sampled undergraduates from one university and from one class. The questionnaires I used did not take into account the different forms of narcissism as discussed earlier. And finally, because my sample was not representative, I cannot generalize these findings to a greater population. In the future, I would like to incorporate the Narcissistic Personality Inventory and the Hypersensitive Narcissism Scale into my research. I would also like to incorporate a multi-regressional analysis to examine the potential third-party variables, mediators, and/or moderators, and I would also like to obtain a sample from a more generalizable population. These are my references, and this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching.